Well, hey, we're going to be continuing on our series this morning, America 250, Catholics in America. Now, the last time that we were together, we were talking about the time period from colonialism to Constitution, if we remember that, and we focused on certain Catholics who were in that particular time period. And we talked about Junipero Serra and his impact. We talked about Father Juan Crespi and his impact in evangelizing the western part of what would become the United States. We talked about the Jesuits that had been Canadian missionaries and were bringing the faith through North America. We talked about the North American martyrs, talked about martyrs. We're talking about the North American martyrs, specifically Father Jean de Brebeuf and his fellow priests who were martyred for the faith. And then we talked about the Carroll family who signed the Declaration of Independence, Charles Carroll. We talked about his cousin, Father John Carroll, and we spoke about his cousin who signed the Constitution, Daniel Carroll, and the importance of Catholic identity in that colonial time period, from colonialism to Constitution, which took us through the Revolution. And so we're going to pick up the story here, 1790 through 1852. Kind of an interesting arc, 1790 through 1852. Well, 1790, the country is now a country. It has a constitution. It has the rules of the road. People have ratified it. The colonies are now states, and they're now trying to find their way. 1852, 1790 to 1852. Math scholars, how much time are we talking about there?
60 years.
60 years, okay. So in about that 60-year period of time, what happened in 1852 in the United States of America? 1852. Of course, if you said the first plenary council of Baltimore, you would be correct, because that's where the church in the United States really established its foundation. And we're going to cover that period from 1790 to 1852, that first plenary council. Now, again, remember last time, population in the newly constituted United States in 1790, how many Catholics are we talking about?
20,000?
25, 30,000, right? 1% of the population. 1852, how many years later?
60 years later.
Yeah, we're talking about
Million? We're talking millions.
talking about 2.5 million.
Irish primarily? Irish.
So think about this a minute. Now remember, text without context is nothing. Contextually, what's happening in the world in 1790, 1800, 1810, technology, communication, did we utilize our iPhones? No. We didn't? We didn't vision cast and air, we didn't do that? No? Did we use our telephones? How about our telegraph? We used our telegraphs, right?
In time for the telegraph, I think.
What were we doing in 1790? How were we communicating with people? For our students' benefit, we used to do these things called writing letters. Okay, and so you would communicate by writing letters. And then 1790, brand new country. Did we have a postal service? Did we have a postal service? Who invented the postal service? Benjamin Franklin. So in the United States, we had a postal service. Now, was it the letter carrier in the nice Jeeps with the driver's wrong side driver? No. Was it her carrying her pouch around while she pushed her wheelie? No. It was stagecoach mostly, okay, and stagecoaches didn't really run on time, and sometimes people would care, oh, you're going that way, here, take this for me. And so it wasn't necessarily the most reliable thing, and that was just inside the continent. But what if you were a bishop, I don't know, John Carroll, and you needed to talk to the Holy Father, the Pope, and you need to get some guidance? Would you give it to the Pony Express? No, it would have to go on this thing called a sailing ship, right? And the wind would have to blow, and it would have to cross over, and then it would go to the continent, and it would go. So it took a long time for communication to take place. So for the most part, those that were operating the church in America during that time period really were independently operating. A lot of subsidiarity. That means decisions were made at the most local level. Now again, in the United States, remember that the British colonies were the foundation upon which the United States was established. And in the preceding centuries, was the church welcome in the British, in Britain, in England? Was the church really welcomed? Not too much, right. So if you're a Catholic in Great Britain, you would send your children over to France where they would be educated in a French-inspired, English-speaking college or seminary. That's where the elite Catholics would send their sons, and where the formation of the priests would happen. They would happen, for the most part, in France for English-speaking evangelization, and then they would go back to Britain, in which case, if they were caught, they were drawn and quartered after they were hanged. Or if they went to the British colonies, they could operate in Maryland, and that's how John Carroll was formed. Father John Carroll, from an elite Catholic family in Maryland, was sent to France, where he was educated by the Jesuits, along with his cousin Charles, who signed the Declaration, and then he was sent back to the colonies, where he celebrated the sacraments as a priest, and then we went through the Revolution, of which his family was very involved. In fact, Father John Carroll was part of the delegation that went to Canada to try and bring the people of Quebec into the Revolution. Benjamin Franklin was part of that delegation as well. Didn't happen, but again, as soon as the Constitution was established and we had a new country, Father John Carroll was consecrated as the first bishop in the United States, and now he's got responsibility for tending to the Catholics in this new country. Where was he formed? France. And that's where we're going to take a detour over to France right now. 1790 to 1800. What's happening in France?
Revolution.
Isn't a revolution a good thing?
No, not there.
It's not a good thing?
No,
We
it's
just
not.
had our revolution. Why is a French revolution not a good thing?
They're murdering the Catholics?
All right, so here's how it works in France. Now remember, in our country, we have these men that wrote these beautiful documents called the Declaration of Independence, where they made their case for independence. And it was very articulate and was very well laid out. France, not so much. They had what was called a king, and in order to validate their revolution, their idea was, okay, well, there's this thing called divine right of kings. So if we show the people that we're going to kill the king, well, that's part of God's will. Sounds like a pretty good plan, right? So we have the revolution, they have the regicide, which is to kill the king, and since the king is dead, now that means I'm the king. And so in the revolution in France, it leads to what's known as the Reign of Terror. Okay, the Reign of Terror was a brutal oppression of people politically in France. Reign of Terror, you had 40,000 people that died in less than 1 year. 40,000 people that died in less than 1 year, 1794, 1795, all right? So the Reign of Terror is terrorizing not only all of France, but all of the neighboring kingdoms around in Europe, because they're like, whoa, what is happening here? The spirit of revolution is starting to spread throughout all of our kingdoms, and our friend King Louis has just gone to the guillotine, and it was like a frenzy. Do you know what brought the Reign of Terror to an end? It's a beautiful Catholic witness. Has anybody ever heard of the Martyrs of Compiègne? Carmelite sisters, 16 of which went to the guillotine because the revolution had swept up. They, like what Jeff talked about with the Mexican martyrs, the church had been outlawed, properties were confiscated, declericalization was happening. You weren't allowed to wear your cassock, you weren't allowed to wear any religious articles, you were thrown out of your convents. So the Carmelite sisters, which is a cloistered order, were kicked out of their convent. And so they were trying to live their Carmelite spirituality in homes, which really wasn't enough for the revolution. So they went in, they arrested all of the sisters, they took them, they made public spectacle as they took them to the guillotine. And it's really a beautiful witness because as they were going to the guillotine, each sister would go to the Mother Superior and say, "Sister, permission to die." She wanted to meet her spouse, Jesus. And the Mother Superior would give her permission, and she would go up and the chop would happen. The last sister was the Mother Superior. It so radically affected the people in the revolution, all of the people that were cheering on the horrible executions in public, that was actually the last public execution in France. It brought an end to the public reign of terror. But that didn't mean that the culture wasn't radicalized by what was happening. During the same time period, there was a place in Normandy called the Vendée. And there was a war in the Vendée between the Catholic remnant who had rejected the ideals of the revolution, supported the monarchy, and so when they were drafted into the army, they refused to serve. And so the revolutionary government sent the troops in there, and 200,000 Vendéans died. 200,000 Vendéans, civilians, died. It was the first modern genocide as we understand genocide today. That's how critical it was in France that the church and faithful Catholics be wiped from this face of the earth. All right. That's the context of which our new country, which itself was born in revolution, different revolutionary ideals, wasn't in regicide, we're going to kill the king. It was in declaring our independence for just purposes, which were articulated in the Declaration and then put into law in the Constitution, that our country was established. But you have these two different examples of revolution taking place. Now, how many people were living in the new United States of America in 1790? About 2.5 million people, okay? That means the majority of the world's population and influence and culture and learning was where? In Europe, right. So we're a country born of European immigrants starting out something new in terms of government, self-government. Why? Because we see the dignity of each and every human person in the other as well as ourselves, and so therefore we create this representative democracy in order to govern ourselves with God's guidance. The United States of America was very much a Christian-inspired constitution. Not a Catholic-inspired, but a Christian-inspired. It's important for us to remember that we have our founders were committed Christians that were fleeing religious persecution when they first came to the colonies. All right, 1790 to 1852. 2.5 million people. By 1852, we're talking about 25 to 28 million people. In 60 years, we've seen radical growth take place in the United States population. As Fabio said, largely Irish, largely what became known as Italians, largely what became known as Germans. Now, if this era of revolution was taking place in Europe and you were being dislocated politically, where do you think you're going to go? You're going to get on a ship and you're going to cross this sea because it's very hard to do that, and you're going to come and try your start over again. A lot of these people were educated, elites that had lost their property in these revolutions that were taking place. You'd had the revolution taking place in Scotland where Bonnie Prince Charlie was trying to reclaim the throne, and you'd have the Battle of Culloden. So a lot of what was taking place was the relocation of Europeans to the United States to establish this new country, many of which were Catholic. And so that's where we see this large growth in population from 1% in 1790 to 7.5% of the population. The largest denomination in 1852 was Catholics in America. So there's an interesting thing taking place during this 60 years. And again, who was the bishop at that time period? John Carroll. John Carroll was formed where? In France. So at his formation, he had been seeing a lot of the winds of revolution that were taking place. He lived through the experience of his own family as Irishmen who had come to the colonies, seeing the lack of justice in Maryland when laws had been passed to deproperty Catholics. They couldn't serve in public office during that time period. And so he understood a lot of this religious persecution and this dislocation of people, things that were happening. All right, 1790 to 1852. Now, the revolution in France reigned for about 10 years, and then it kind of took a breath because there was a strong man that came into power. Does anybody know who that strong, short man was? Napoleon Bonaparte, okay? So Napoleon served the revolution and the revolutionary government and helped to bring stability to what was a very unstable environment. And then he became what was called first consul of the Republic in France, right? So a man that came up through the revolution, became the unifying person through strength, and then the revolutionary government established a republican form of government. He was the first consul, meaning he was in charge. He brought stability to it really by conscripting all the young men. Do you know who causes trouble in society? Young unemployed men. And so he said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to take all the young men, we're going to put them into the army, and we're going to give them food and clothing and training and purpose, and we're going to teach them how to march and how to carry guns and how to organize and work together. It's a pretty good way to stabilize a population. He did that, did it well. And so the first consul of the Republic then decided, you know what? I've done such a great job of stabilizing France with the Napoleonic codes and the rules and the laws. And you know what? We're not going to kill the church. What we're going to do is we're going to put the church under my umbrella. So the church became subservient to the state, and the state was headed up by who? Napoleon. So it was a short step for Napoleon to go from first consul of France to emperor of the French Empire. Well, in order to be emperor, you got to have an empire. And in order to get empire, what do you do with those young men? You send them out to the neighboring countries, and you conquer them, and you take over their stuff, and you say, submit or die. And they say, well, I'll submit. Okay, great. Then we got to get rid of the king. Okay, and so the revolutionary ideals of France start to move into Austria, into Russia, into what became known as Italy, into Spain. And every time he would conquer a country, he'd say, you know what, you need a new king, a new representative. I know, I got a brother, and he put his brother in charge. And so he had kind of the family business going on there. So he is the Emperor of France. Now during this time period, everywhere that Napoleon goes, whether it's in Egypt or Syria or Spain or Portugal, he's exporting the French Republican ideals of revolution. And part of that is the relationship between church and state. Because remember, the kingdoms that were primarily Catholic were part of what had been known as Christendom. And Christendom was held together by the political thought of a man named Charlemagne, Charles the Great, right? So the Dark Ages were ended when Charlemagne unified all of the warring factions through military might, but then put himself not in charge of the church, but he put himself under the authority of the Pope, right? And so that's what created the Renaissance, and that's what led into this time period. So from really 850 until about 1790, Christendom had been the European kingdoms that were ruling through divine right of kings. And while that may or may not have worked out well over those 9 centuries, it existed. It was the law of the land. And so when the Napoleonic codes came in, they basically blew apart what was left of the Holy Roman Empire. And Napoleon himself crowned himself emperor. So he was in charge of all of Europe, right? Napoleon went until about 1814, in which case he was sent into exile. Then he came out of exile and for a short period of time was back in charge, in which case he was defeated at Waterloo, and then he was sent to St. Helena where he died of cancer. So that Napoleonic influence was so powerful worldwide that it had impacted us in the New World. Not only with the mass migration of people that were being pushed out of their European homes, but also people that had come to France. Much of Quebec were people that were relocated Frenchmen who then, thanks to Napoleon's great real estate deal with Thomas Jefferson, that was called the greatest real estate deal since Christ Cathedral. So we got to double the size of the continental United States for $10 million. And so Napoleon sold basically all of the Ohio River Valley all the way down into Louisiana. And he then opted for himself not to export revolution into the new United States of America, because at that time, New Orleans was part of what? French Empire. And there actually was a plan for Napoleon to export the revolution from France to Haiti and use that as a jumping off point to come and invade New Orleans. So instead of doing that, which was extremely expensive, he sold that area to Thomas Jefferson, and we got not only all of those states, but also the French claim to what was called the Floridas. The Floridas, plural. Why plural? Well, because in the Floridas you had Spanish Florida, which was now part of the French Empire, but then you also had British Florida that was part of the British colonization. And so since there was no more British colonization, that was part of the United States of America. So during this time period, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, and the states above it, all the way up to Detroit and Michigan, et cetera, and the Great Lakes areas, all that came into what was the new United States of America through the Louisiana Purchase. So you have French culture in this new United States of America. You have Spanish culture in this new United States of America, and they are religiously mostly what? Catholic. Okay. So you have these 13 British colonies, which has now doubled in size, or became states that then doubled in size of landmass that were largely Catholic. So now we start to have this Catholic experience taking place in the United States during the time period of 1790 to when? 1852, exactly. So all of this is taking place in the first decades of the 19th century. Church has to navigate this space somehow. There isn't really a system in place to see a sevenfold growth in Catholics in this time period. So Bishop John Carroll is petitioning the Holy Father and saying, Holy Father, we need help. We need bishops and we need priests. There's just one problem. That strong man who was rather short, what was his name? He had arrested the Holy Father. And he put Pius VI into jail, and he died while he was there. And then later a conclave elected Pius VII, in which case Napoleon decided to arrest him. And so it's difficult for the Holy Father to freely exercise his papal responsibilities of selecting bishops to send to this new world. And so it was, again, very difficult. It didn't just happen like, oh, you're the new bishop of New York, go take your see. You couldn't even get proper documentation, let alone knowledge that you were supposed to go there, et cetera. And so the foundation of the first 5 dioceses in the United States, Baltimore was already in place. John Carroll was the first bishop. The see for the United States was all of the 13 colonies at that time period, and then the new territories that were starting to come in. All right, so they gave the United States, the new country, bishops in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, we were already in Baltimore, and then they gave us a bishop from the port city of Bardstown, Kentucky. Port city? What do you mean port city? Well, that was the jumping off point for westward expansion into the southern Ohio River Valley. And so those first 5 dioceses, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, all seaports. Okay? So the seaports are where we did trade with Europe. It's where the immigrants came in for their port of embarkation, and so they're being welcomed in. And where newly immigrated people did was they went to where other people that they knew were, and so they settled in cities or towns that were becoming cities and places of trade and then later manufacture. And so those were jobs and there were communities. And so where there were jobs and there were communities, you needed buildings that we call what? Churches. Okay, so we're going to give you bishops because where the bishop is, that's where the church is. The bishop is the fullness of the priesthood. The priests that operate under his authority, what's called incarnation. What Father Glenn said when we were talking about Lee was he checked with his chancery on what he could do because Father Glenn exercises his priesthood through the ministry of the bishop of the ordinariate. And so this authority is very important in Catholic teaching because the bishop is the successor to the apostles, and so that authority has come on through apostolic succession. Well, if the bishop's so important that he's a successor to the apostles, do you think it's a good idea to have the Emperor of France arrest the successor to Peter? Probably not, right? So this is where all this tension is being worked out. Where does the authority come from? Who's in charge? How does this work? And people are just trying to get along and go along, stay alive, get fed, try and improve their lives, launch this new country over all of the obstacles of that particular time, which might have been bad health, because in those days, County of Orange employees, what's important? Health and human services. Did we have that in those days? Probably not. So sanitation, hospitalization, health care. In the United States, where did those things come from? Catholic Church. All right, so that, people are just trying to settle in this new country. They're trying to have a home. They're trying to have a job. So the church is trying to meet the needs of the people. Okay. 1790 to 1852. We're seeing a sevenfold increase during that time period of Catholics. Church can't operate freely because of what's happening in Europe. Pope has been arrested. Pope dies. Another pope comes, he gets arrested. He can't freely exercise. Let's talk about these first 5 bishops in these first 5 sees, because we're talking about Catholics in America. The Diocese of Baltimore, 1789. It's the premier diocese, covers all 13 colonies, which become states. Who's the first bishop? Who becomes the first archbishop? Because he's then given what are called suffragan dioceses in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Bardstown, Kentucky. All right. So in Boston, that was established in 1808. 1808. Pope is arrested at this time period. He's actually been taken to France. He's not even in Rome. Okay, that's been established to cover New England, all of New England, including Massachusetts and the states around it. And the first bishop of Boston is Jean-Louis Chevreul. Does that sound like an Irish name?
Yeah, different Irish.
No. Okay, you got a French missionary, a Sulpician, who's now the first bishop of Boston. Diocese of New York was established to cover New York and parts of New Jersey. The first bishop is Richard Luke Concannon. Good French name? No, Irishman. All right. He's a Dominican priest. Now, what's interesting about Bishop Concannon, he dies in Naples in 1810, never having taken his see, because he can't come to the United States because of the Napoleonic embargo of the ports in Europe. So the first bishop of New York actually never came to New York. Second bishop was Jean Dubois. Good Irish name? Frenchman. All right. He's the only non-Irish bishop that New York has ever had as a see. Interesting. The first bishop was a Frenchman. Where was all of the formation happening for the good, bright men who were being formed for the English-speaking church? In France. So that's why this French influence in our early church formation is so important. The first bishop of the Diocese of Philadelphia, which was also established in 1808, covered Pennsylvania and Delaware and parts of New Jersey, was Michael Francis Egan. Good Frenchman? Irishman. All right. Bishop Egan also happened to have been a Franciscan. He was an OFM, which means he was a member of the Orders of the Franciscan Minor. He was consecrated bishop in 1810. He was the diocese was established in 1808. The Diocese of Bardstown, Kentucky, was established to cover Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Northwest Territory. Does anybody know what the Northwest Territory is? It's one of those weird, quirky things of history and geography. When I think of the Northwest Territory, I think of where? I think of where Quinn comes from, Oregon and Washington. But that's not what these guys were talking about. The Northwest Territory is really the Ohio River Valley, which was where the Indians lived. And so if you were going into that area, it was out there. Hadn't been settled yet. So in Bardstown, Kentucky, the first bishop was Joseph Flaget. Irishman? No, Frenchman, French missionary. Okay, so the French and the Irish are the first bishops in the United States of those first 5 dioceses. Baltimore, which had been established right at the beginning of the country in 1789. Diocese of Boston, 1808. Diocese of New York, 1808. Diocese of Philadelphia, 1808. Diocese of Bardstown, 1808. So the church is allowing for the organization of dioceses and assigning bishops, but because of what's happening in Europe, some of them aren't even able to come and take their jobs. And getting here from Europe is an arduous thing to get here. So those first 10, 15, 20 years, when all of this immigration is happening and the dislocation of people from Europe, it was very difficult for the church. The Louisiana Purchase took place in 1803, which doubles the size of the country. And at that time period, there had been an existing diocese that was overseeing New Orleans because it was Catholic. So that became the Diocese of New Orleans in 1825. And then again in 1853, right at the end of this time period, the second diocese in what is Louisiana is founded. That's called the Diocese of, try this word, Natchitoches. Natchitoches. Say that one with me. Natchitoches. It's a tongue twister. Today that's the Diocese of Alexandria. So in that time period, 1853, the second diocese in Louisiana, which was largely Catholic at that point, was founded. Up until that time, it was all through the Diocese of New Orleans. Okay, our time period, 1790 to what? 1852. All right, well in 1846, we decided, this new country of ours, decided to do something kind of interesting. President Franklin Pierce had an idea. You know, it was pretty good with that purchase. Been a pretty good real estate deal, doubled the size of the country. But you know what, on the other side, there's a whole lot of land there. And if we keep going on that land, we can get to the Pacific Ocean. And if we have the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, we're going to have one country from east to west. In history, we call that manifest destiny. Well, in order to exercise our manifest destiny, we had to go to war with this new country called Mexico. What do you mean new country? It had been there for hundreds of years. Well, actually it had been under the Spanish Empire for hundreds of years, and the war for independence in Mexico took place in 1821. The war for independence in Mexico, meaning independent from Spain, took place in 1821. All right, now let's think about this. We were talking about that period of time from 1790 to 1852. 1800, Napoleon becomes the strongman in Europe, becomes emperor of the French Empire. The French Empire conquered what country on the Iberian Peninsula? Spain. And so Mexico, which had been part of the Spanish Empire since 1492, or when it was conquered by Cortez in 1501, all of a sudden they're looking around going, why do we want to be subservient to these French guys? And so they declared their independence, and you have a revolution that takes place in Mexico in 1821. All right, so Mexico is newly independent in 1821. 1846, the American president Franklin Pierce said, hey, this is a new country that doesn't have a lot of organization. It's a ripe opportunity. Tell you what, let's go to war with them. Because of our friends in Texas, where a lot of Americans have been settling, and their rights are being usurped supposedly, and so let's go and let's pick a fight with them. And so we have from 1846 to 1848, the American War with Mexico. General Winfield Scott goes in, conquers Mexico City, and at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the new United States of America ends up with Texas, Kansas, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, California, Wyoming. It's a large expansion of the United States of America. Territory that was mostly unsettled, that was mostly inhabited by indigenous people, many of which were migratory, warlike people that took place on horseback and were nomadic people, and that's a talk for a different day. But now that's under the responsibility of the United States. So at that time period, 1848, we end up with the Diocese of Monterey in California, which is now part of the American territories, okay? The Diocese of Monterey ends up becoming the Archdiocese of what? Los Angeles. Think about that. Los Angeles wasn't much of anything at that time period. Monterey had been the capital of Alta California for the Spanish and then later Mexican government, and so Monterey was the first diocese in what we now call California. The first bishop of Monterey was Joseph Sadoc Alemany, a Spaniard and a Dominican. Here in Orange County, we owe a lot to Bishop Alemany because he's the one that sent the Dominican Sisters of Mission San Jose to Anaheim to serve the German-speaking immigrants that were in Southern California at that time. Now, also in that territory, we ended up with the Diocese of Galveston. Galveston is next to Houston. It's a port city. And that diocese included not only all of Texas, but parts of Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. That's in 1847. It's in that arc of period of time between 1790 and what? 1852. So in 1847, the Diocese of Galveston is established, and the first bishop of Galveston is Jean-Marie Audin, a French Vincentian priest, who's later the second Archbishop of New Orleans. Remember, Galveston, which is on the Gulf, it's a port city very close to New Orleans, which is on the Gulf, which is a port city. The newly renamed Gulf of? There we go. All right. So now there's another diocese in this time period which is established in 1850, and that's the Diocese of Santa Fe. Now, Santa Fe was a colonial city for exploration, for evangelization during the Spanish Empire, but it became a diocese in 1850. The first, or that diocese encompassed New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of Colorado. And the first bishop in 1850, his name is Jean-Baptiste Lamy. Irishman? No, Frenchman. French missionary who had been a priest of the Diocese of Cincinnati, which grew out of the Diocese of Bardstown, Kentucky. So again, the church in the United States, the first 5 dioceses are established in 1808 under the jurisdiction of now Archbishop John Carroll, and he's administering the new country states at that time period, largely in the 13 colonies, and then the territories are directly next to them. Then we have the Louisiana Purchase, which takes place in the early part of the 19th century, in which case mostly existing cultural institutions were there, largely the educators known as the Ursuline Sisters, French sisters. The Ursuline Sisters had established convent schools during the French exploration of the Mississippi River Valley, and also in the port of New Orleans when it was being established, and then also in Santa Fe in New Mexico, the Ursuline convent was there. So again, this French, Spanish enculturation of the United States during that time period when a Catholic population goes from what? 1% to 7%. In 60 years, you have a 7-fold increase. It becomes the largest religious denomination in the new United States of America, largely influenced by French-formed, English-speaking priests who had been formed for service either in the British Isles or in the new British colonies. They were formed in France or by French missionaries who had worked for France through what was then New France, which became Canada after the French and Indian War, in which case Canada became part of the British Empire, and then also part of Spain. Priesthood had been formed in Spain for work in the Spanish Empire, and then later in the Mexican Republic, which declared its independence, which then became part of the United States of America during this expansion of manifest destiny. So much of our Catholic identity that we experience today is rooted in Spanish enculturation, which you can see in that church over there, thanks to Jeff bringing the reliquary from the Knights of Columbus. How many people are in there? 6 priests who gave their lives, right? Mexican and Spanish enculturation Catholics. Many of the French-formed priests that were either French missionaries or who had been English-speaking priests who had been formed in France at this time of revolutionary experience. First in the United States, and then later in the French Revolution. 2 different examples of revolution. In the future, we're going to be talking, as we continue on in Catholics in America, we're going to come back to this revolutionary ideals, because much of what we experienced in the latter part of the 19th century, but certainly in the first part of the 20th century, is rooted in this confusion about revolution's legitimacy and the inspiration for those revolutions. And are they to build people up in the image of likeness of God, or are they to kill God and therefore make man superior to God? We'll get to that in later dates. But for right now, 1792, 1852, that's what we're talking about today. Okay, 1852, we said what took place at that? The first plenary in Baltimore. What is Plenary Council of Baltimore? Plenary Council. That means that the suffragan dioceses all got together in 1852 under the the leadership of the Archbishop of Baltimore, who invited all of these brother bishops to come in and say, look, guys, we've seen a sevenfold increase during this time period. We got to bring some standardization, because what's happening in Santa Fe isn't necessarily what's taking place in Boston. What's happening over there in Bardstown, which became Louisville, isn't what's happening over there in Cincinnati. And what's happening in Cincinnati isn't what's happening over there in New York with these unrulable Irish immigrants that are peasants. We got to figure this thing out. And so this becomes the beginning of the structural church in the United States. Because of the plenary council in Baltimore, which included the 6 archbishops, 24 bishops, and numerous theologians, with the Bishop of Monterey present as well as a guest bishop from Toronto. Kind of interesting. Bishop of Toronto came to the first plenary council in Baltimore. The purpose was to unify the Catholic practices across the United States, which had grown significantly since their early provincial councils. Key decisions. They confirmed and extended decrees from previous provincial councils nationwide. If you remember the talk that we had with Chris Weir in November, what was the one that this council talked about? The formation of Catholic schools. And that the schools are even more important than building the church buildings. The Plenary Council in Baltimore says the first thing that we have responsibility for is the education of our people, so that they can live a standard of life that is dignity, which means that they need to read, they need to be able to write, they need to be able to reason, they got to know the rules of the law, they got to be able to be good Americans and observe it, but they've got to be good Catholics, so they have to have catechesis as well. And for that reason, we need Catholic schools, particularly at a time period where Protestants were pushing back against this huge influx of Catholics that were growing, and they're like, let's make good Protestants out of them through our public schools rather than having pay for Catholic education. So that was the big tension at that time period during the Council of Baltimore. So, confirmed and extended the decrees from previous provincial councils nationwide, urged the bishops to establish schools for Catholic children in every parish. They set regulations for canonical administration of dioceses and the publication of marriage bans. What is marriage bans? A marriage ban is a public notification that these young people here, maybe not so young, but these people here are going to come together in marital contract, and we as a community are going to witness that. That's how important marriage was and is. At the earliest council that we had, marriage was dealt with. Recommended the creation of new metropolitan see in the city of San Francisco. What was happening in 1849? Gold rush. And gold rush quickly gave rise to what? Comstock lode. And the Comstock lode was mostly silver that was then exported through the port of San Francisco. So now we have a new trade route going on, and it exploded wealth in San Francisco to the point where they arrogantly named themselves the city. You ever heard that? Oh, yeah. You ever see the Golden State Warriors put the city? Who do these guys think they are? Don't they know Orange County's the city? Come on. All right. So they were making the creation of the new metropolitan see in San Francisco. The outcome. Pope Pius IX confirmed the council's decrees in September 26 of 1852. The council was the first of 3 major plenary councils held in Baltimore, 1852, 1866. What happened just prior to 1866? So 1860 was critical for Catholics, and then 1884, which defined the structure, the discipline, and the direction of 19th century American Catholic Church. Now, I'm going to wrap this up with some interesting observations. Who's the patroness of the United States of America?
No, Immaculate Conception.
Let's try that again for the slow people in the back of the room that are sleeping against the pillar over there. Who is the patroness of the United States of America? Let's try it again for the people that are sleeping on the pillar over there. Who is the patroness of the United States of America? The Immaculate Conception. Thank you very much. Okay, why is the Immaculate Conception the patroness of the United States? Well, in 1792, Bishop John Carroll, the first bishop of the United States, officially consecrated the United States to the Immaculate Conception. In 1792. Brand new country. You thought we need a patroness? That's the one that we're going to go to. Why? What was the name of Christopher Columbus's flagship? Santa Maria de Immaculada Concepcion. Sometimes we miss that. All right, so Christopher Columbus's flagship was named the Immaculate Conception. All right. The French missionaries who explored the Mississippi River Valley. He's got a big university named for him in Milwaukee, Wisconsin right now. They play pretty good basketball. Al McGuire was one time their coach. That's called what? Marquette. So that priest's name was what? Jacques Marquette. And he would go down in a canoe and he would explore along with Joliet. And he named that river, which the Indians call the Mississippi, Mississippi. He named the Mississippi River the much easier river of the Immaculate Conception. So when you think of the United States, from the headwaters, which are outside of Minneapolis, St. Paul, that come all the way to New Orleans, that interior artery, the largest the river in the United States, which is the conduit of so much trade even today, is actually named for the Immaculate Conception. Christopher Columbus sailed from the Old World trying to find a new route to the Indies on a ship named for the Immaculate Conception. Archbishop Carroll named as patroness of the new United States of America the Immaculate Conception. So in 1846, at the 6th Provincial Council of Baltimore, prior to the first plenary council, the bishops unanimously chose the Immaculate Conception as their country's patroness, and they asked the Holy Father for permission to have her proclaimed patroness of the United States of America. Now, Len just gave us an observation. The dogma was not proclaimed until when?
December 8th, 1856.
54?
I'm sorry, yeah, 1856.
Okay, so December 8th, 1854, the dogma was proclaimed. But she was proclaimed patroness of our country in 1848. Remember, something is not true because the church teaches it. The church teaches something because it's true. The dogma of the Immaculate Conception, which was codified in 1854, had always been believed by Christians from the earliest time period of the church because she's the mother of God, the God-bearer, the Theotokos. We just navigated through the next 1,800 years before it was actually codified in writing forever for people to understand. Something is proclaimed dogmatic because it is absolutely, unarguably true. And so the church has said, look, just to make sure everybody understands this is true. So the Marian dogma of the Immaculate Conception is the patroness of our country. Has been true since the time period that she was immaculately conceived. But what's interesting in Father Carroll, then Bishop Carroll, and then Archbishop Carroll identifying the Immaculate Conception as our patroness is that the United States of America is a wholly new form of government conceived in a new way. And so it's completely appropriate that she is the patroness of our country. Because even here, 250 years later, with so much confusion going on in the world, whether it's a good idea to have representative democracy and people that represent us and that we're a rule of law, or are we a rule of might? We're still trying to figure that stuff out because of what's called concupiscence, man's inordinate desire to be fallen and sinful and serve self rather than the other. So again, having the patroness of the Immaculate Conception for our new country, and now 250 years later, our existing country, we couldn't have asked for anything better. So the inspiration of the Holy Spirit upon Bishop Carroll, and then later the first 5 bishops, and then later as the dioceses continue to grow in the United States, we have much to say thank you to for them for putting Our Lady at the prime responsibility for placing her mantle of protection against us.